Yeah, I'll just do a little intro. Sure. Yeah. Welcome everyone to the CK Speakers Forum. This evening, we're very fortunate to have a speaker who first came to us about it was probably back in 2012, wasn't it? Fall of 2013, back in the fall of 2013 or sometime in 2013. He was the first speaker to speak with us, actually, and he was the inspiration for the CK Speakers Forum. This is kind of an offshoot of Coffee Chat, as some of you are aware of. And there was, after Prakash did his talk, there seemed to be an interest in it, so several of us got together and we decided to have a speaker-centered event once in a while. As you noticed, there was a $5 cover charge, which is not never the case with Coffee Chat, and we'll explain that as the evening goes on as to what that's for. And there's nobody. It's not funding the speakers forum. The room gets funded by purchasing coffees and so on, so that gets handled. The restaurant wants something for that. Now, CK Speakers Forum, CK stands for Crystalline Knowledge, and Rick didn't bring his jukebox this evening, but that's a song that was the inspiration for it. It was by Buckingham Nicks back in the 70s, and it was about, it just has a nice message to it if you want to listen to it. Now, the last time Prakash talked, he talked about heedfulness in the Buddha's Dharma, and he ended off with there was suggestion about meditation towards the end, and there was a little bit of a talk on hindrances that can come up in meditation. So this evening, that's what Prakash is going to touch on, as far as I know, but it's as a surprise to me as it will be for anybody else, I suppose, the details of what he's going to talk about. Just a few other points. If you do have a cell phone, it would probably be a good idea to turn it off. And at the end, Prakash will have a chance for questions and answers. He's probably going to speak for less than an hour. During his presentation, unless he asks or prompts input, if we could please just take notes maybe, if we have, rather than interrupt him, because once he gets going, he'll probably want to keep going. At this point, I would say, hopefully everybody would help me to welcome Prakash Venglat as he talks about the Buddha's Guide to Meditation. Welcome, Prakash.
Hello, everyone. Just to start off with, the whole idea of coffee chat, and actually, it is interesting because the word chat is a very important word in meditation. So ideally, when we talk about meditation, what we're doing is trying to settle down the mind. So instead of getting our thoughts reaching out to many things, I like to think of my brain as not something contained within my skull, rather have extensive neurons that are stretching out to different galaxies, to different universes actually, and to our kitchen tables, to our coffee mugs, to our children, to our wife, to our husbands, to our families. It's reaching out to different things. And what we're doing in meditation as a tool or a technique is to bring those neurons back into the brain, bring those thoughts that are focused in very distant points back into our thinking process of our brain. And I think that's the key thing. And so with regards to chat, coffee chat is something where we discuss with each other, but in the meditation, the word chat has also a significance. First thing is you want to quieten down the internal chatter. Part of meditation is to quieten down the internal chatter. And the reason you want to do that is so that you allow the people who are talking softly to show up their heads. Because if you have too much of noise, then those softer voices are going to be completely drowned. And that's why it's such a challenge to do something like meditation. The challenge is you have too much of chatter. And how do you quieten down that chatter It's like walking into a movie theater with a superstar playing on the screen, and you have hundreds of his fans come to watch the show. They're all talking about his achievements when the movie has already started. And you as a person who's interested in watching the movie, what would you tell them? There's nothing you can do. You just wait for it to be quiet. And a lot of times in meditation, you need that patience. You sit down and you wait for the chatter to quieten down. That's just a kind of a overview of the whole thing. But to bring Buddha's perspective into the picture, he, if you look at his earliest story, the key story that you listen to is that he was a rich prince who was barricaded from his outside environment. So he never knew what things happened outside his palace gate, and he was living in a very luxurious environment. So one day what happened was he got a chance to get out of that compound, and what he witnessed was all kinds of suffering. So if you look at Buddha's story to lead us to this topic of meditation, see, each person has his own story, and Buddha's story to guide us as a teacher into this process of something which we call as internal inquiry, instead of looking at things outside, was his own story where he showed that if you barricade yourself, and if you live in an environment which is completely barricaded, then that's a sort of luxury, then you don't sense the suffering that is existing outside. And so when he got outside, he saw all kinds of suffering. He saw people growing older and aging, and people dying, and people being burnt, and people suffering all kinds of illnesses. And so his challenge was, instead of ruling this great kingdom which his dad had created, his challenge was to step out of that and ask the question, how do you overcome this problem of suffering? And so if you look at how he went about doing it, he didn't have any guide who actually had to show him the way. And that's why he felt that it was part of his responsibility after he achieved what he achieved during the process of waking up to this suffering, or waking up to understanding that he had to transform himself into a teacher. Actually, at this point, there's a very interesting story that is worth mentioning, because Buddha always talks in terms of questions and answers. So one of the things that happened was when he first started teaching, he always has a story of how there is always this tempter, or the demon, or the Mara. So it's a fight between the Buddha and the Mara. So the Mara, or the temptations, are the ones that come interweaving into his thought process as he's trying to quieten down his mind. You have these different features of his own mind which appear as demons or Maras that comes to block his stability of his mind. And so he tells that story to everybody, that he says that that when you start to do this kind of meditative process, the first thing he had to overcome was all these, what he called as the Maras, or the demons. And to simplify it, they are nothing but hindrances, or the blockages. And that brings us to a method of how we can actually use this process to understand how our mind works. So if you want to distill his image to us, or his image and idea to us, his image that we see, as Steve had put up in the website, is just a poster of him sitting, which is symbolic of a lack of movement, right? That if somebody is sitting quietly and not moving around, not being distracted, and with his palms down, all that is an indication that his gaze is pointing downwards, is that he's channeled all his thinking inward. That is the first step in achieving a tranquility or meditative state. But that alone won't do it, because if you try sitting like that, if you try just as you're doing it, if you try sitting like that even for 2-3 minutes, your mind already will be somewhere else. You'll be wondering what what's going to happen at 9 o'clock, or what's going to happen tomorrow, or is my child getting his food, or various things that can happen will disturb your mind right away. But how do you go about sustaining that? So once you achieve that state of inner awareness, how do you sustain it so that it becomes a process of self-inquiry? Not just a place where you just go sit and you just forget yourself, but rather you travel inwards as the mind stabilizes. That is the most difficult thing to practice, and also, as I see standing here in front of you, to communicate. It's a challenge to communicate. The challenge lies in because it is a very experiential process, and it's a very gradual process. And one of the things that I was thinking of as a good metaphor, if you want to take meditation as a life skill, I think it's a skill. And if you want to take it as a life skill, no matter at which point at the stage of life you are, you could be 13 years old, or you could be 100 years old, no matter at what stage, or anywhere in between. At any point is not a bad point to start. It's a life skill that carries you all the way in a much better state of mind than otherwise. And to bring the depth of that practice into perspective, I'd like to use the metaphor of a seed. So if you want to have something grow and nourish, it won't happen quickly. If you take the best example is a seed. If you take a seed and if you put it in the ground, and if you put it in the ground and just walk away, it's just like sand. It's going to get destroyed. You put the seed and then make sure that you come and water it. Make sure that it germinates. And when it germinates, make sure there are no bugs growing on it. Make sure it's protected. And when it just started producing leaves, gives it fertilizer. And when the plant starts to flourish even more, make sure there are no weeds around it. And as it is growing, you make sure that there is enough sunlight, enough energy that is coming to the plant. Eventually it starts to flower. And once it starts to flower, make sure the bees are available to visit it. And it is the same thing with meditation. When you start off, it is very simple. You're just putting the seed in the ground. You've decided that you're going to practice a skill which is different from the other things that you do normally. But once you put the seed in the ground, you have the responsibility to come and water it periodically. And there are many things you have to watch out. If you give it too much water, you're going to bury the seed way into the soil. It's never going to germinate. If you water it too little, again, it's going to fail. So you have to find the right balance. That's another thing that you will see as you start to practice meditation. You have to find the balance. As you sit, the first time you sit, you don't want to think about achieving big goals. You just want to sit there for 10, 15 minutes or 20 minutes. But then, that doesn't mean it's going to not do anything. Just like when you put a seed in the ground, you don't see anything happening for a week. That doesn't mean you give up watering. But one thing you have to remember is, imagine you have a plot of land, right? And you consider that it's right in your backyard. You get out of your backyard and you have a small spot there which is nice. You put the seed there, right? That's like finding a spot to sit for meditation. You find a nice place. You don't just go sit on your sofa and try to meditate. That's not going to work. You find a nice place in your room which you have in some way sanctified, in the sense that you give it some sign of respect. Just like you find a nice ground to put your seed. You find a nice place to go sit. Not in front of the TV, not with another magazine, just by yourself, just sit. And when you sit, I think the best way is to follow what posture you see in Buddha. Have your back as straight as you can, so that your mind is attentive to your posture. The reason you keep your back straight is that any other posture where you lean or in other ways, your mind is going to go to sleep. Your mind will go to sleep because once it is comfortable, the first thing the mind does is shut off. You might have noticed that. If you're really tired and if you're watching a nice TV show, what happens? You wake up after half an hour and say, oh, the show's over. And that can happen to meditation too. When you get too comfortable in your seat, that's what happens. So you have to find a place first. It has to be clean and comfortable, just like for the seat. And the second, the place has to have some kind of significance, which is you find a nice chair, you invest some time, or you can get meditation cushions. You can buy a cushion, or you can buy a small thing there where you can seat yourself so that you don't have to go flat on your legs, but just enough so that your body is still and you can keep your posture straight. And you won't see any change happening because you just started, just like the seed. You won't see any change, but you would still go there and still water it. Repetition is a very important part of the practice. So once you go find a place to sit, you don't give up. You do it every second day, every day if you can. And when you do it, you tell yourself there is a seed that is waiting to germinate. There is a thought that is going to die, and there's a new thought that is going to emerge. And that's going to give me the clarity. And that kind of persistence in practice is very, very essential in the early stages of practice. Just like the persistence in finding the seed and watering it. And the other comparison that I would like to make is if you have a plot of land, and if you put a seed, and let's say you suddenly decide to go out for a vacation for 3 days, and then you don't tell your neighbor where the seed is. The neighbor is going to water something else. So you cannot give it up to somebody else. You cannot say, I'm going to go read a book about meditation instead of doing it. That's not going to help. See, these are the things that is very difficult to understand initially, but once you get to that framework, you see that there's no other way. You cannot go suddenly say that I have questions, I'm going to go pick a book and read, and not do this. You still have to do this. You still have to come and water that seed. Until the seed emerges, you persist. You have to persist in giving it the right amount of water. And same with meditation. When you persist for a week or 2 or 3 weeks, every day, almost, if you can, almost at the same time. And when you're doing it, there are certain, it's like going to a gym. The other example I have is going to a gym, right? If you're going to a gym to do some exercise, I'm sure you won't eat a big meal, right? If you have a big meal and if you go to the gym, there's no way your body is going to be exercised the right way, because all the blood is rushing to your gut, right? The same with meditation. You don't do it after eating a big meal, because when you eat a big meal, all the blood is going to your gut or to your intestine to absorb the food. You're going to fall asleep. If you do want to do meditation after eating, the best way is to walk and meditate. In the early stages. Let's say you're really busy, you're at a conference, you're doing a workshop, you're doing something, you're very busy. You can still continue the practice. And the practice can be as simple as finding a quiet place to walk in a garden or a path. And as you walk, pay attention to your steps. And paying attention, coming back to the topic of sitting and paying attention. In Buddha's, one of the main techniques, if you see in literature, including the one person whom I learned with, is breathing. Because it integrates many things. Just by taking a deep breath, you feel a lot comfortable. Just by sitting and taking a deep breath and leaving it out, you feel a lot comfortable. But on a daily basis, we are breathing all the time. And one of the Buddha's ways of bringing the mind back into focus is to focus on that breathing, so that you start to make it a little more comfortable than what it is. And it can work both ways. For example, if you're very lethargic and sleepy, you can invigorate your body, you can energize your body by taking a really deep breath. And then your sleep goes away, and then you can come back to your meditative pose. So these are the early stages. In the early stages, you practice repetitively, focusing on your breath or something that that will keep your attention in that space. And once you get to that point where you feel a little bit more comfortable, that's when you have to really watch out for what is called as falling asleep. In simple terms. That is the extreme. But the first thing that can happen is your thought will start to wander. So the example that in earliest Buddhist texts that I really latch onto in my own way of understanding it is having a cow. Since we are an agricultural province, I'm using all these examples. So if you have a cow and if you have a patch of grass, right? If you leave the cow out there, it's going to graze all over, right? That's how the mind is too. But if you put a peg on the ground, and the peg is your breath, watching your breath, right? And if you tie it with a cord that is sufficient for it to graze, and the cow is a thought and the grass is the thing it feeds on. So your mind, as thinking, is feeding on many things. So what is it going to feed on when you sit to meditate? Is it going to feed on how can I buy the next best car? Or is it going to feed on something else? So you have to watch out for that. Watching out is the next step in the process of meditation. Watching. First is building, settling down. That is building a focus or concentration. But the next step is being mindful. The word mindful, you might have heard that in a lot of texts, or if you go online. Mindfulness meditation they talk about. But in reality, mindfulness only follows concentration. Because the concentration is like the cow, which is tied by the cord. And the peg is your breath. So once you're focused on the breath, you can let your thoughts wander only so much. And if it's wandering too much, think of that cord. And think of the cow going away. Get reminded by the cord. And the cord is your mindfulness. It keeps you mindful of how far the cow is away from the peg. How far the thoughts are wandering away from your breath. And once you connect to that, it becomes a very active process in your mind. So the two paradigms, modes of concentration and mindfulness slowly become one unit. They're like two sides of the same coin. One side is the concentration, where you're focused on the breath, which is the point of focus. That's your concentration. And the mindfulness is how far you want to let that thought wander away from that. You want to have thoughts which allows you to keep your focus on the breath even more precise. You want to become mindful of the breath itself. You don't want to become mindful of other things, which is outside of that domain. And becoming mindful of that breath, you can become mindful of subtle things. The first thing you can become mindful of is, am I breathing shallow? Am I breathing deep? Am I breathing in a way that's comfortable to me? And when I breathe, do I feel pain in my body? These are the questions that will fit into that framework of that cord which ties the cow to the peg, the thought to the breath. And once you have that process happening, then you can find, because the reason why the mind wants to feed on other things, I like the concept of feeding because it's a very interesting concept, because we always want to get things. Even with meditation, for example. When we sit and do this, we want to get something out of it. Right? We all want something out of what we do. But here's an example where you can do the exact opposite. And this is another concept in Buddha's text of generosity. When you practice generosity, what happens is your mind opens up in many different ways. There are many different things that happen to your mind when you practice generosity. For example, you walk down the street and you find somebody who's extremely handicapped, and you help the person cross the road. That completely changes your mind, because it opens up different parts of your brain. Because the first thing is you've become aware of somebody else's suffering. Second, you've taken time away from your process of whatever you wanted to do, and you did something for that other person. And that's something that person will never forget, even if you forget. But that's just a simple example. But coming back into the framework of meditation, there's a very important concept that is associated with that state of mind, a generous state of mind. Because when your mind is clouded of what I want to get, there's a lot of barriers. Let's say you're sitting to read a good novel, and your mind is constantly worried about how your stock markets are doing. Your mind cannot be focused on the novel. The same with your mind when it wants to come into a point where it's going to settle down. If it is worried about who's going to take what from me, that state of mind, I'm just contrasting the two states, versus a state which is generous, which is, what can I give to this meditation? What can I give to this process? And so in Buddha's text, there's this word of goodwill. So he says, when you sit on your place where you found your peace, and if you sit there, as soon as you sit there, you don't just say, how's my breath going to be first? You say, let us have this concept of goodwill. That's an act of being generous. And it doesn't have to be goodwill for somebody else. It can be goodwill for your own self first. And that's what he says. The way he says it is, to bring your thought back into the focus, what he says is, you start with, as an exercise with goodwill. It's a very nice exercise, because it starts off by saying, you have goodwill for your own self, which is, you watch how your body feels, how your mind feels, and you feel at peace. And as soon as you feel that, you spread it. Spread it to your friends and family. Right? And then once you've spread it to your family, if you still feel don't settle, you spread it to people whom you don't know. Because there are so many people in the world whom you don't know. But if they have peace of mind, I'm sure it's going to contribute to your peace of mind. If there's less violence in the world, it's going to be better for us. And then he asks you to take one more important step. He says, spread goodwill for people whom you don't like. And when you do that, that again opens up parts of your brain which was a barrier. A barrier which says, I'm going to cut this person off. I don't want to think about this person. What it does is, it opens up your mind to think about even the people you don't like. And these don't have to be people, eventually. These can be just parts of your mind you don't like, parts of your behavior you don't like, parts of your phase of life you don't like. You can open up to those things once you develop that concept. But to start off with, you can't touch these difficult topics without actually practicing it. It's like going for a marathon. You can't get up one morning and say, I'm going to run 20 kilometers today. You're going to come back and lie in bed for 10 days, I'm pretty sure. So if you want to go on a marathon of goodwill, you don't start off by spreading goodwill for everybody in the world and forget about yourself. You start with your own self. And you take care of your own self by practicing in the right way again and again. And again, coming back to the metaphor of seed, which is very powerful, because you don't see much happening. That's another thing with meditation, is that you don't see much happening in the early stages. You're just watching your breath, you get up and you go and you say, nothing happened. Because you're expecting something out of it. So in the early stages, you always want to give something to it. Just like in the early stages of the seed, you don't see anything happening, but you still pour water. But imagine if the seed is that of I want to give you an extreme example. Imagine if it's a seed that requires, I was watching a show on National Geographic where these seeds of legumes, a particular tree, it's a huge seed. This has to be dropped in the ocean. And it has to float in the salt water for, I don't know, for a long period of time before it reaches another coast, at which point the covering, the seed coat, can actually rupture and the seed germinate. Sometimes your meditation can be like that. It can be really tough. But still you have to remember the seed is still there. That's the reason why I'm giving you examples of these sort is that sometimes it can be like grass. All you need is a sprinkle of water, and then you see grass is green. Something is growing, right? That can happen for many of us, that as soon as you sit to practice, you'll see some change. But for many of us, we might not see changes. It might be like that seed, which has to float in the ocean, across the sea, and go onto the other shore. I don't want to say that it's that difficult. I don't want to discourage you. But at times, it can feel like that. When your state of mind is disturbed, it can feel like that. Because one thing we have to remember is that we are not talking about something that is static. Even though we give examples of seed and a cow, our mind is much more sophisticated than a seed or a cow. And that's where the complexity starts to trickle in as you start to practice. And at the same time, that's where the joy comes in. The joy of practicing starts to come there. When you start to get that confidence that you have your own inner guide that you have starting to nourish and grow. And many times you need help, you need guidance. And at any stage of life, you need guidance. And for my own practice, I found a person who's a monk in California. His name is Tanisawa Bhikkhu, and he focuses on the breath. And he focuses on how you can treat breath in different ways. I'll just give you an example of how he treats breath, because since we're talking about breath as a point of focus. He says you can treat breath in different ways. As you sit here and as you breathe deeply, you can think of breath as something solid that is going into your body. You can feel it going into your body. It's a solid substance that actually fills your body. And you can have that to build stability, groundedness. You become part of the earth. It's a solid phase in your body. But as you start to settle down, too much solidity is not good because it starts to make you sleepy. Then he says, think of it as a liquid. The oxygen in the blood, for example. As you breathe in and breathe out, what happens? The blood comes to your lungs, and it absorbs the oxygen from the air that you've inhaled. And where is the oxygen now? It's in your blood, and it's a liquid form that is moving across different parts of the body. So this is what is called as gross and subtle and sublime states of breath. The gross state of breath is how you feel it as it goes through your nostrils into your body, fills up your lungs or your abdomen, and then it starts to come out, right? That's a gross state. But as you start to settle down your mind, you can go into the little bit more subtle states, which is you don't have to really focus on, like a pump. You don't have to focus on your nose, pulling in air and pushing it out. You can just phase out of that motion and just feel the air filling in your body and feel the air leaving your body. And these are different states of awareness. And this is where, once you start to build the focus, you can bring mindfulness to it. Becoming mindful of it as being a solid thing first, which gives you groundedness. And as you start to practice, you can move into more subtle phases. And again, I can come back to the metaphor of the seed, because I think I like the seed metaphor, because once it starts to nurture and grow, once it becomes a seedling and starts to grow, then you see it happen, right? You see visual growth. And then it's the same thing. If you translate that into meditation, once you start to feel something happen inside you, that you can actually sit there for 15 minutes a day and no matter what happens, you can come back to it. That is actually the plant has taken root. The seedling has initially struggling, and suddenly it finds root into the ground. And once it finds root into the ground, imagine you forget to water it a day. It's going to be fine, because the groundwater is going to help it. But that doesn't mean you don't want to come and sit and meditate. What it means is that you can give away some of the rigorousness of the practice, which is you sit there and you hold your body in that position, that saying that I won't move. You might not have to do that, because you might have already rooted yourself in the right way. But as soon as you root, the important part of the practice comes next, is beating. Because along with your taking root into your breath and focusing on it, you have other problems that can creep in, which is your old habits of how you perceive things, which is your old ideas of how you think things are. All that is going to flash in. And they are like the other seeds that are sitting around. Because as you nurture the ground with water and fertilizer, you're also going to support the growth of the other seeds, which are your latent tendencies in your mind that already was pre-existing. And those tendencies are going to show up as you start to settle down. And this is where meditation becomes what people call as therapeutic. In the first stage, it is a kind of a physical activity. In the second stage, it's becoming therapeutic, because it's like the small latent tendencies start to show up, and you can now have a sense of confidence to treat them. That you don't necessarily have to latch onto those anymore. The tendencies of wanting to get angry about something. Your ability to let go of those tendencies become much more easier. Compared to the stage when you were earlier on. Earlier on, you'll be very reactive, and as you start to settle down and as practice becomes more and more concretized or solid, and as the plant is rooted, then your tendency is to watch the anger as it comes. That's what happens. Your awareness becomes much more refined. So you can start to watch the anger as it comes within your mind. And you can tell, I don't have to react to that. I don't have to react to that hatred that comes in your mind. So these are the therapeutic, or instead of the word therapeutic, these are the tendencies that show up when your mind becomes more and more stable. And this is where this the whole concept of where people talk about concentration as becoming important versus the mindfulness becoming important. But actually, they are two sides of the same coin. You become mindful of the concentration just so that the concentration is still there. The example which I've heard from Ajahn, the teacher, whom I've learned with, is like holding a chick. You just have to hold it just the right amount. If you hold it too tight, you're going to squeeze it. If you hold it too loose, it's going to fly away. That's what mindfulness is with reference to concentration. If your concentration is held in the right mindfulness framework, it'll be held. But if the mindfulness becomes too strong, what happens is your mind starts to think too many things. And as the thought process starts to get triggered up, it's going to swing out of your mind, swing out of that boundary. And it's very difficult to bring it back. So that's where the practice goes to the next level. To be constantly mindful of how you're watching your breath. And many a times at this stage, if I go on describing it, a lot of it might just sound like words to you till you actually practice it. So if I'll just come back to those tendencies that the mind goes to in terms of, because that might be more concrete in terms of understanding rather than talking about the other stages. Because if you look at the word hindrance, or the things that can come and disrupt your concentration, the things that can interrupt your stability. I picked up 3 words, and I thought that might be interesting to share. That discusses that those tendencies in our mind, and each one has its own quality. Quality in terms of what it does to your mind. One word that is used is called affliction. The word affliction is interesting because what it does is, what does affliction do? It afflicts some kind of pain, right? When something is afflicting you, it is afflicting and causing some kind of pain or suffering. So that is one tendency of these blockages that can come. They can cause some kind of a pain or suffering in you. Right? That's something that is happening to you, right? But there's another word that is commonly spoken about, which is called hindrance, as a blockage. And the word hindrance is, the definition for hindrance, if you look up any dictionary, is it's some kind of a resistance. It's preventing you from going to the next stage. It's providing some kind of a resistance, delay, or obstruction. Right? So this, again, we have to come back and remember that the framework is still within maintaining concentration. Right? So when you're trying to maintain concentration, the first thing that can show up is afflictions. Afflictions is something that causes pain and suffering. And that will be the first thing that disturbs us. As we sit quietly, the first thing that can disturb us is some noise somewhere. And our mind starts to wander on that noise. And that is going to cause pain and suffering to your concentration. Because suddenly you realize you've lost the flow of your breath, and your mind is elsewhere. But these are things that we use as tools. These are not some things we think of as a problem, but as tools. And the reason they are tools is because that is a kind of process of mindfulness. Right? If you're not mindful, then you wouldn't know what the affliction was, what was causing that disturbance. So one thing is the breath that you're focusing on. The second thing is what is disturbing that breath? What is disturbing your focus on the breath? So there are 3 qualities that's why I picked up these 3 words. And 3 words signify 3 different qualities of those kind of what I called as disturbances. One is an affliction, something that causes pain or suffering. It can be within your body. As you sit and meditate, suddenly you find your left part of your body is aching badly. And that's common. We'll have, as we age, we'll have a lot of body problems. But still, when you focus on the breath and focus on how the breath is moving in your body, you can shift your point of focus. For example, if you have a strong ache on your right part of the body, you can shift your focus to the left part, which is feeling not too bad. But by having that focus shifted, now your mind is a little bit more comfortable to focus back on the breath. This is one example. But there are many afflictions like that. There are many things that can cause pain and suffering. It could be some death in your family. It could be something, some traumatic situation at work. It could be any kind of pain or suffering. But still, when you come back to the practice, when you come to sit, you have to learn to focus on the good things. And that's why goodwill becomes very important. Because life is not static, life is dynamic. Just take the example of what Buddha said in terms of as you age, your body is going to wither away and it's going to go away. If you focus on that element itself, as you sit, there's no other way that unless until you feel goodwill for your body, you cannot bring any focus. And that is one of the things he did. He said, as he saw suffering outside, he brought it back inside. He said, no matter what I see on other people, this is exactly what's going to happen to me. It's not extrinsic or it's not outside of me. This is eventually what is going to happen to my body. So how do I understand this suffering within this lifetime? That was his challenge. So even though the whole idea of his narration is very simple, his depth of focus was very deep. he was focused on his own life as being very transient. Just like every one of our lives, we live only for 100 years, or depending on our lifespan, it can be even shorter. But the essence of it is that there's a lot of change that's happening, and in spite of it, he said there is actually a path to end the suffering. And that's where he found this process of focusing on the breath or doing meditation becoming very helpful. It's not something that happens just to change your mind for something better. It changes your mind for something totally a different way of looking at things, where you see streams of suffering or streams of sorrow or streams of joy coming. But if you come back to the meditation, none of those is going to be a hindrance. That's where the point of focus is. None of those qualities that come as change is going to hinder this that you hold as concentration and mindfulness. None of those will become a hindrance if you stabilize your mind. And the concept of breath is very interesting, because the first thing you do when you're born, when you come out of your mom, the doctor gives you a slap on the butt and you start to cry. And that is to instill the first breath. And when we lie in our deathbed and when we pass away, the last thing we do is let go of the breath. So bringing the breath back into that concept in his way of looking at things was again a lifelong approach. It's not something you pick up as a hobby and just learn and just forget. Once you practice it, there's no way you can let go of it, because no matter what, you can be in the elated point of your life or in the lowest point of your life. This will be the middle ground you come to, always. And that is very essential, because that gives you a fundamental balance into how you look at things. Because another thing, if you think about it, what we see out here in this world, as we perceive it, is an activity of our neurons, nothing else. The simplest example, coming from a plant background, the simplest example is every time we see a plant, we say it's green. It is not green. It is reflecting the green light. That's because the plants, when they fix the light, they're absorbing the red wavelength and they're bouncing the green light. But we say the plant is green. And a lot of our realities are like that. That's an example of how deep our perception of the reality is. Right? And so the reason why I mentioned it was our mind is not very simple in terms of being contained in the brain. Our mind is actually an activity of an interaction of our brain with our surroundings. So if you don't have a stable ground to watch the surroundings, then there's a lot of confusion. And that's why this practice of meditation becomes so essential in how we approach our daily life. That's the way I see it. So coming back to the hindrances, first we talked about afflictions. Right? Afflictions is anything that causes pain or suffering. The second word is much more, it's not something that just happens to you. These pain and suffering just happens to you, right? It just happens. There's nothing you can control. That somebody is going to pass away, that something is going to happen, something bad is going to happen. There's nothing, sometimes you don't have any control over it. But there are many things you can control. And that's where the word hindrances come. Hindrance is a blockage, right? And if your mind is stable enough, and if you're watchful, you can observe the hindrances. And as you start observing the hindrances, you can use them effectively to change your behavior. And the 5 hindrances which commonly is talked about, it's instead of having it disconnected as 5 different words, I would like to link them. Think of stages of growth. Okay? This is a better way of understanding it. Think of stages of growth. And the best example I have is going back to a child. If you give a 2-year-old boy or a girl a toy, right? Let's say it's a ball, the boy holds a ball, right? And you go into that space of that child, and you're not aware how attached the child is to the ball, and you go pluck it from its hand. What would be its reaction?
Cry.
It won't
Scream.
scream. It won't just say, "Can I please have the ball back?" No, it's going to scream. And that is one of the aspects of our mind. It's not just the child. We never grow out of that really. We always have attachments, except that the attachment is not to the ball, it's something different. So the first hindrance is called attachment. And there are different flavors to it. According to Buddha, there are different flavors. And English language is in no shortage of all these words. So I'm going to give you some words which rhymes with attachment. And some of those words are harsh. For example, greed. If you're greedy, there's an element of attachment. I actually wrote a whole bunch of words here. The other word which Buddha often talks about and which is misinterpreted, it might be a right place to bring it up, is called sensual desire. So in Buddha's time, the way he taught people was to convert them into monks. And when he converts them to monks, then they go into monastic life, which means that they completely withdraw from sensual desire. But that was just a lesson I think Buddha was trying to teach. He was not saying that, being celibacy is the only way to do things. But I think what he was trying to show as an extreme example is that sensual desire drives quite a bit of our mind and our mental thought and mental energies, mental processes. And once we associate sensuality with desire, that's where the problem is. That there is a good-looking lady out there is not the problem. That my mind is latching onto that and not watching the road is the problem as I drive. You see? The good-looking lady is part of the environment, right? But my mind was not stable enough as I was driving to focus on the road. I glanced, accident. That's the funny side of it, but there can be really bad sides to it. So these are examples which are very colorful and which are very useful, which can be used as part of our mindfulness framework to put our attention back onto the breath. For example, as you're sitting and suddenly you think about your desire to have the butterscotch ice cream after the meditation, driving your thinking process away from your stability, immediately you can bring the framework back to the breath and say, that can wait. I'm not saying that's not important, but in this space, at this time, that can wait. And when your mind can train itself repeatedly in that fashion, the stress or the pain associated with that kind of wanting to stop it slowly fades away. It's no more painful. You actually start to sense joy because you have more control. It actually directly allows you to control how you eat. But this is just one facet. You can control many things. Once you sense the attachment driving your thought away from the breath, that's the first hindrance. The second hindrance as a point of growth, coming back to the child with the ball, right? The child has the ball. The child grows a few months older. The child's uncle comes visiting. The child's uncle brings him a flashy car. The child kicks the ball away. I don't want the ball anymore, I just want the car. The child gets attached to something else, but at the same time, the child gets detached. And that the more appropriate word for that is hatred. That's another tendency of the mind. As we go past certain levels, we start to have that tendency show up. So once you stabilize your mind so that it doesn't reach out for all these sensual things or things that attracts you, your mind starts to reach out for those spots of mind where somebody had disturbed you, somebody had said bad things to you, or some latent anger you had over some uncle who had disturbed you in the past, or some friend who took away some of your valuables. The next thing the mind reaches for is those tendencies. After the attachment comes detachment or hatred. The mind's second hindrance is hatred. It wants to hold on to those thought processes which are, once you start to calm down and get your sensual desires or these attachments slowed down, these manifestations of hatred will start to show up. Or they can show up at the same time. So the second tendency, as you want to stabilize your mind and focus it back on the breath, you will find is that this constant motion of detachment, which is hatred, anger, ill will, all these words form in the same cluster. But to make it easier and to have a bead, I think I like to use that attachment, hatred as the next step. But then you can use your arrows to connect them to other words. And the word detachment involves hatred, ill will, anger, all those things fall in the same framework. Okay, now let's go back to the child. You have attachment, you have detachment. The next step is, let's say the child gets detached from the ball and the child looks through the window to the opposite house. And there's a boy with a helicopter flying inside the house. The child goes to his mom, I don't want this car, I want the helicopter. The child is deluded because the helicopter is not going to come. It belongs to the other child. So coming back to the meditative framework, it's again interesting because once you have attachment and detachment overcome, which is too much of attractiveness or too much of hatred overcome, you can go into a phase your mind doesn't know what to do. So it's a delusional phase because the mind usually is used to either getting attached to things which it is attracted to or getting attached to things which it doesn't like, causing those emotions associated with anger or ill will, or causing those emotions associated with I want that, I like that, and all that stuff. Once it overcomes both of these, the immediate phase that it faces, that comes right at its phase, is delusion. It's a state of confusion. I don't want to get attached to this. I don't want to hate this. What do I do now? At this stage, the mind is coming to a stage of balance. It's not swinging to that side or this side. But when it's in the phase of delusion as a hindrance, what it's going to do, it's going to swing this way, swing that way, swing this way, swing that way. And that's where concentration wavers. It's like a candle. It keeps flickering. Because your mind wants to get attached, and then it says, no, I want to get detached, and then it goes to sinks to the other side. So it's like a pendulum. It swings back and forth. And that is actually the delusion. But as you watch the delusion, you can say, I can just stay there. And when you just stay there, you've had the first taste of some stillness. Till that point, you don't have stillness. You're trying to still the mind. So once it starts to swing back and forth and you come to a point of balance, when you see the delusion actually on its face, then the mind, as it focuses on the breath, can slow it down and say, I don't have to be deluded, I can just stay there. And that is the first sample of stillness. But as it stays there, your mind is still not quiet. Because the stillness is not sustained. It's just a flicker. Think of a cigarette lighter. You flick it, you see the flame come out. It's just a pilot light that flicks. It just goes off. But you, as you're meditating, watching your breath, you keep flicking it over and over. Think of a very rusty cigarette lighter. That's how our mind is. It's very rustic. So as you keep flickering it over and over and over, you'll still see the pilot lamp. But as soon as you see the pilot lamp, you should feel content. You should feel happy that you still have a pilot lamp. And you check, your mindfulness at that point is to check and see if there's fuel under. And if there's fuel under, you keep flicking at it, keep flicking at it. That's where persistence comes. The sense of persistence and endurance as part of the practice is right there. So as you sit at that stage, you don't give up. You don't say, oh, I'm not deluded anymore, just get up and go. You stay there with it. Sustain that stillness. When you sustain that stillness, it's more or less like your mindfulness is watching the fuel in that rusted lighter, and your concentration is nothing but the flicker of the pilot lamp. And you keep repeatedly doing it till it catches fire. And once it catches fire, the fire is still. You have a still flame. I'm just giving you a metaphor to say that at this point, you don't. So going back to the example of breath, the exercise is watching the breath as a point of focus. And mindfulness is to prevent all these hindrances from affecting that at the early stages. That's what mindfulness is doing. It's preventing attachment to become a bigger problem. It is preventing the hatred, the detachment. And then it's slowly focusing on the delusional phase and preventing it from becoming a problem. But like I said, when the flame is lit, what you happen to see is a physical evidence of having overcome delusion. Till that point, you're not sure. Till that point, you think, oh, your mind is still swinging back and forth or is sleeping or whatever. But if you keep your focus for the half an hour or 20 minutes you sit for meditation, and you keep watching that as you progress through that, what you will find is that suddenly you'll find a phase where your mind is just comfortable just to be there. And that's almost like you don't have to have that mindfulness of constantly watching the fuel and the flicker, because you have the flame. Do you get that metaphor? Because till that point your mind wants to watch and see if there's any hindrance coming. Right? If there is any attachment flowing towards it, if there is any hatred or ill will, if there's a delusional phase. All that is like watching the fuel, if the fuel is still there. Your mind wants to be reassured every time. And the other thing it does is it watches the breath, right? So that's the flicker. But once the flame kicks in, the concentration and mindfulness come together. At that time, you feel much more comfortable just being there. And you're not worried if you're focused or not, because you're already in that frame. And no matter what you tell now, you'll never get that till you're in that phase. And once you're in that phase, you are in focus. So that's a third hindrance. The fourth hindrance, which are a little bit more, these are much more subtle in the sense that it's very difficult to explain it. The simplest word people use is pride. Because the practice is not a one-day affair. You're going to do it on and on and on. So what you'll start to do is, once you get a confident state of mind, the confidence itself becomes a hindrance. The confidence has a negative side to it, which is pride. You're confident initially, but then it becomes pride. As it grows, that's what it becomes, because your mind always wants to compare. You go to your workplace, you meet your friends, you do things, and then you're constantly comparing. Look, I'm meditating, I'm better than that person. You see, that's a natural tendency that happens. It's just like having a good car. If you have a nice flashy car that you bought for $50,000, as you drive down, you look at that other car. It's a natural tendency. And that tendency doesn't operate anywhere else. It operates right in your mind, where you're meditating. It operates there too. And when it operates there, your flashy car is nothing but your confident mind. And your confident mind says, look, Look at that. It's comparison. And so there you have to be much more patient. To come back to your place of meditation as you watch your breath, you watch that. So every time you're watching, you're mindful about something along with the breath. Initially when you started, you're just mindful about the breath. But as you go into the practice, you become mindful of the attachment along with the breath. You become mindful of the detachment, of the ill will, of the hatred, of the anger that comes up in your mind along with the breath. And then you're mindful of the delusion. And then comes pride. And the pride can come in many ways. You can be proud of your young body, at which point you can tell, I can be in 30 years just like that old person. And immediately your mind can snap off that kind of thinking. So there are different ways of triggering your mindfulness. And if you read Buddha's texts, all his texts, narratives, are to trigger those states, which will allow you to see your right mindfulness. Because he cannot come into your head and tell you what state your mind is in. You could be at that earlier stage or the later stage. But what he gives you is examples and useful guidelines to trigger your mindfulness to the right frame of reference. That's another word, a right frame of reference. So once you have a right frame of reference, then you're mindful about the right thing in the context of your own meditation, in the context of watching your own breath. And that's with pride. The fifth hindrance, the last one, is a much more comprehensive problem. Comprehensive means it includes everything, right? It's called ideation. Ideation is that you have a method to solve problems. You get fixated on how you solve these problems. So as you did your practice, you watch your attachment, you say, this is how I solve it, right? And you fix that method in your mind. So when new attachments come in, you view it through that same window. You start to shut down other windows. So in the last step, what he does is, he allows you to open all the windows. Initially, you're closing windows to observe through one window, each problem. But in the last stage, the problem gets a little bit more complex because once you have a method, you're going to use only those methods. And you won't be open to listening to your own self after that. You will just sit there and say, I'm going to watch this, watch this, watch this, watch this, watch this, and think that is the process. But this is just the beginning. Because you're just watching the hindrances. This is like going to the gym and lifting a few weights and stretching. But remember, you're not going to the gym just to lift weights and stretch. You want to run a marathon, right? So the first part of the whole exercise is just strengthening. So you're developing what is called as the inner strength. And how do you develop the inner strength? By watching these hindrances come up, by watching your breath, by stabilizing your mind, by being very persistent and repeatedly doing that. And once you get to that phase, then is the potential for all the growth. You will still have these frameworks operating all the time, but they will happen for the first few minutes of your meditation. The first many times you do it, your whole meditation will be preoccupied with these phases. Nothing wrong with it. You can be an extremely advanced meditator and still go to that ground level every now and then. You can be a novice and you can go to heights now and then. But the consistency in doing it over and over and over is what's going to really benefit you in the long term. In the long term, what is going to benefit you is consistently doing this. Becoming mindful of a particular point of focus, concentrate on it, which is the breath, for example, and then watching the hindrances arise as they come, and watching them lapse away and gain confidence from that, but not become too proud about it and methodical about it, still be open about the whole thing, and then practice. That is the first fundamental level in Buddha's way of meditating, the first fundamental level. And if you go, there are many other levels which he takes you to. And his whole, so I don't know if you remember from my earlier talk. So in Buddha's, so how many minutes do we have?
Well, you're an hour 10 so far.
Let me finish off with another 5 minutes of talk.
Okay.
So putting this whole framework back into Buddha's context, there are two main things. So when people ask Buddha, what is your main essence of doing this? What is the main reason? What is the main thing? What is the one thing? And he says, all these things that I talk about is only about one thing. Just one thing, which is to end stress and suffering. So all these things you're doing is not a game. It is directly relevant to the stress and suffering that you're involved with. That was his first thing, he said. But he said, in order to make that clearer, I have two different methods. One is called the first methodical observation was called the Four Noble Truths, which is when he went out and he saw all the suffering, he said, so far he didn't know about that. He was ignorant about that. He was completely ignorant that there was suffering. And many times in our meditation, we'll go through these phases. We're completely ignorant about something, and suddenly we become aware of it. So the first thing is, we are completely ignorant about suffering. That's the first noble truth. The second noble truth is, he doesn't say we are ignorant of suffering, he says there is suffering. Up to that point, you don't know that, and suddenly you say there is suffering. So that is overcoming that earliest ignorance, there is suffering. The second noble truth is, there is the actual understanding of that suffering. Initially you just observe, oh, there is suffering. Before you didn't even know that, and suddenly you said, yes, there is suffering. The next step is, you try to understand it. There is an understanding of that suffering. The third level is, there is a way to end the suffering. There is actually an end to the suffering. And the fourth, which is the most important, which comes directly to the meditation and practice, is there is actually a path to the end of suffering. So the meditation falls in that last fourth noble truth. And he pairs it up with a very efficient way of understanding the path. So he said there is a path to the ending of suffering, and he said this path is actually not very complicated. He said there's only 8 steps to this path, 8-fold path, except that it folds again and again and again. It's an 8-fold path. And the 8 folds are nothing but, it starts with right view, right resolve or intention. So view is how you view things. Intention or resolve is how you make, how you understand it from your own perspective. Right view, right resolve, right speech. How do you communicate that to yourself? The speech doesn't have to be external speech, internal speech. How do you communicate that to yourself? How do you communicate that resolve? For example, you have a right view that I want to meditate, for example. You have the view that meditation is good for you. So based on that, you resolve that I will do it. But if you say I will do it, the next minute your mind will forget it, because it will say I will do something else. I will do something else, right? But how do you make that resolve into action? By having the right speech. The internal speech that you create. How do you create that internal speech which tells you this resolve and this view is right? So you have to have the right internal dialogue all the time. And when you have the right speech, then you have right action, which is coming back to your meditation spot every day, just like you put the seed in a spot, not forgetting the spot, making sure you come and nurture it every day till it starts to grow. So that's the fourth, right action. And when you have right action, then you have right livelihood. Right livelihood here is a very general term. It could be livelihood to make your income to survive. But here, I think it's better to translate it in the meditative framework as some things that you do to make sure that this thing is always done. You do other things to make sure this is done. That you come back to your meditative spot and sit there for half an hour. As a beginner, I think that's how I like to look at it. That you can find the right livelihood so that you can support this process. When you have the right livelihood, which means that you have enough resources to do whatever you have to do, then you can put in the right effort, which is actually sitting in the meditative spot, repeatedly doing the things that you need to do. That's right effort. And the last two steps is what we talked about throughout the talk. Right mindfulness and right concentration. So the foundation is mindfulness and concentration. But that foundation won't stand without all the other things beneath it. If you don't have the right view, concentration, mindfulness is going to waver. If you don't have the right resolve, it's not going to be existing. So you create the right view, the right resolve, right speech, internal speech or external speech, which allows this to sustain, right action, right livelihood, so you have resources, right? Right effort, which is coming back to the spot, and then right mindfulness and concentration. Those are the last two slabs. You can look at it both ways. You can look at it top down or bottom up. Just like a plant. The bottom up is the roots way into the ground. But that's what is holding the plant. So if you don't have all those built into that framework, your concentration and mindfulness is just going to be floating. It's like a seed. It'll remain a seed. It'll go from here to there, it'll be blown, till it finds the right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort. Then it starts to take root. Then it starts to grow. Till then it's still a seed. So I'd like to end that talk with that as long as you put the seed in the ground and nurture it, that's exactly what meditation is. Like, it's a little bit more than that.
Did you want to take some questions, or
Sure.
you feel? I mean, wait.
Do you ever use a mantra?
Well, I usually encourage
For me, I'm kind of like, yeah, you can use some kind of a phrase, because in this lineage, the lineage that the particular group I work with, they come from what is called as a forest tradition. And forest tradition is these monks, they live in the forest, and they train people there. And when you do that, one of the things they use is words like Buddha, or a phrase, which you repeatedly say along with your breath. It's not independent. It doesn't matter whatever, but I think the best thing is still the breath. But you can use a word with it, no matter what the word is. But it still has to be centered around your body. It cannot just be a voice, right? If you connect it back to your breath, and if you say Buddha, connect it back to your breath, then your mind will be more centered on it. If it is just a word that you say, you can be playing tennis for all you know and still saying that word. It doesn't make any sense. And it has to be centered around your breath. And I think the easiest way is, if you want a guidance in terms of a mantra or something, you can use that. But still it has to be focused on your breath. And that brings your awareness to your body. And then you can easily align your body to the good qualities it has rather than focusing on the negatives. Because the mind has a tendency to latch on pain. That's a common thing. And that's a very interesting aspect of our brain, because our brain, as soon as we have one small pain, it has a tendency to make it so big. It'll spread it out in all directions. And that's one thing you can clearly see when you meditate. You can channel it so that you can focus it on the right place in your body.
Is it true that meditation offers all kinds of health benefits?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yes. First thing it does, it calms your mind. And when it calms your mind, your mind is producing all kinds of signals to different parts of the body. And you can see the benefit right off. Within a few weeks, you will see a lot of benefit coming from. But I think that should not be the only motive to meditate, because that may be the sustainable factor behind. It's like saying I'll water the plant only for 6 weeks and then let it dry. That's the way when people look at it as a health benefit. Even though it has a benefit, to make it sustainable and long term, I would look at it as a benefit for your whole mind and your whole well-being, rather than just your body, health. Maybe health in all phases, inner, yeah. I think that might be a more rounded way of looking at it. Yeah. That adds more value too, right?
How do you deal with intrusive noises, sounds in the environment when you're trying to meditate, like somebody doing dishes?
That's an easy example.
How do you, because it's very intrusive, and how do you deal with that? How do you talk?
The most easiest way, but I think might be the most difficult way, is to bring those people back into the meditation.
How do you
Whoever
do
is
that?
disturbing you, tell them to come and sit. That's just a side button. The best way to do it is to find the quietest time of the day.
But there are always going to be environmental sounds that take you outside of maybe where you want to be. So how
As
does
quiet
it-
as it can get. The easiest time would be early in the morning, if you can get up a little bit earlier than the others in the household. That might be a quieter time to do it. And actually, that's the best time to actually do this, because you don't have other distractions. All the pressing issues start after that. When you get up, you can think that for all others' care, you can be still sleeping. You just get up half an hour ahead. Think that you're going to brush your teeth 10 times. You need extra 20 minutes. And then you wake up early, and then you come back, and then you do your meditation, then you go about doing it.
I like what you said, because I was trying to do some of that, like trying to be still when I was in my car reading and this person, we won't designate, this person comes into the Timmy's parking lot, 2 vehicles down from me, and of course I have my window open for the fresh air and my puppy and all this stuff, and he has this pounding music that I had when I was 15, but he leaves the music on, he gets out of his car, locks his car, no one's in the car, and goes into Timmy's. Like, who the hell wants to listen to that when you're trying to meditate? And I mean, my ears were vibrating. It wasn't like he was enjoying it. Well, he probably heard it inside, but, and I thought, how are you supposed to cut it? So I just sat there and I was seething. I was going, either you're going to move in 5 minutes or I'm moving, because it was just like totally destroyed my serenity. It was just so obnoxious.
Lynn?
So I know.
Lynn, that would be hindrance number 2.
There was lots of that there. There was lots of that.
Hatred and detachment.
I can tell you that.
Yeah.
It's very true.
See, Linda, actually, that's a good way of doing it.
Yeah.
If you see that show up,
Yeah.
and you saw the anger come in you, right?
Well, my quarter's always pumping. I'll
Right,
tell you.
right,
Yeah.
right. If you apply mindfulness to it at that point, you can spread your goodwill to that person.
Oh, I wanted to spread something to it. It wasn't goodwill.
Yeah, but that's a good point, though.
That was
Uh,
his greatest neck.
So if I heard you right, okay, one of the benefits you get out of meditation is that the process, the thoughts stay with you. So
Right,
you
they
do
become
your
stable.
meditation in the morning, you ground yourself, you get your stability. At 8 o'clock at night that night, by virtue of you being a regular meditator, thoughts that
Exactly.
otherwise would be a problem in your life, you know how to deal with. And so
Exactly.
you change your behavior
Right.
through what you do.
Right.
That's it.
Actually, I did write a note about it, but I didn't know how to bring it up, but so there are three aspects to, so if you have concentration and what we call as mindfulness or an understanding, before these two comes what we call as virtue. And virtue is a very complex word, but it has a lot of meaning, which is values and behavior. There are values you hold, right? And there are behaviors that are associated with the values. So virtue is nothing but a combination of the two. So by constantly practicing your meditation, which is becoming focused on your breath through concentration and becoming mindful of that, your values and behavior are going to change.
To impart self-awareness.
Right.
Which you may not otherwise have.
Right, but also it will open yourself into dialogues with like-minded people, with like-minded ideas. And that's going to open up your mindfulness even more. That's why I said the first step that we do is just setting up a template for further growth. So that's the thing about the fifth hindrance that I talked about. You have to be really watchful once you start to grow to a point. You don't want to have too much of methodical ideation, that this is the only way to do it. What I'm doing is the best thing kind of feeling that comes up at that last stage. It becomes a hindrance just because of that. It prevents you from getting into dialogue with other ideas. See, at that point you open up yourself to other ideas because you have a stability in your mind. You can observe others and get the right things out of that. Before you would just reject or accept. Now you can have a dialogue. See, that's the next stage of growth. The first stage is always, we always have a tendency to either reject somebody's idea or accept it, but not actually have a dialogue. You might have noticed it when two people talk, especially husband and wife. You know, when they start to talk, the husband wants to see what he can accept, and the wife wants to see what the husband will accept, and vice versa. And that's what we think is a dialogue, but that's not a dialogue. That's a monologue, actually. And occasionally, when there is this aspect of what we call love between the two, then you'll see the words trickling into a dialogue. But many times, it is just a monologue with an occasional dialogue. And if you're watchful, you can observe that. And I'm not any way excluded from that. I'm 100% within that same framework. Especially when we are attached to somebody, we take that freedom to go into monologue. You'll notice that. I mean, if you have somebody whom you're really attached to, you go into monologue. And the best example to take is your own self. Your own self. You're most attached to your own self. And so when you sit there, you think in monologue. You're not having a dialogue. You're not letting the environment come in and give you the right feedback. You're not mindful. You're not watching the hindrances. You're just letting the monologue happen. And sometimes it's like watching the same movie. Imagine there is the worst horror movie you've seen, and you decide you will park your car in front of that drive-in theater and watch that movie 1,000 times. That's exactly how we treat our mind. It's no different. We have some angry incident that triggered anger in us. What we will do, we'll sit through the night and not sleep and flash that same scene over and over and over and over and over and over. In the morning we say, damn, that guy, he disturbed my sleep. But he didn't disturb your sleep. He didn't come and put the screen in front of your face. You decided to keep it in front of your face. And those are the things you learn as you progress through meditation, that some things you self-inflicted. The incident happened 10 years ago, for example. You will still flash it over and over and over and traumatize yourself for reasons totally ununderstandable to you. Till at some point you say, okay, it's time to let go of it.
Despite thousands of thoughts we have in a day,
Exactly.
80% or more are the same thoughts over and over.
Another example that's actually quite interesting to think of is like since I talked about the horror movie and the drive-in theater, the example that one can think of is like a screen. the screen is not the movie. And the screen is just a screen. The movie is what you flash on that screen. So the screen, if the screen is full of holes, then what you're going to flash on is not going to be clear. Let's say you have a drive-in theater screen, and some bunch of teenage vandals came and pelted it with big stones, and you have big holes. When you start off, I'm just giving you an example, when you start off doing meditation, you have a screen full of holes. So initially what you're trying to do is patch up those holes. Till you reach a point where you can actually see the movie on the screen. But once you see that the screen is actually different from the movie. You can project any movie you want, the screen is still remain clean. And that's where you want to get the mind to. You want your mind to reflect thoughts like a screen. So it can be very useful to project the thoughts when it's needed, like watching the horror movie once. And then say, that's enough, turn it off. And the screen is still there. Next time a thought comes, it can project on it for whatever is required. And then again, it can be still there. So in a way, kind of a meditation, in one way of looking at it, one of the benefits is to have a clean projection, a clean screen. That's just one of the benefits I can think of, based on the context in which we spoke today, is that it gives you a clean screen so that your thoughts can be projected on it, with all the hindrances, with all the problems. But then you know it's just the problems associated with that thought. And once the movie is turned off, there's no trauma associated with those thoughts on the screen. There are no stones hitting the screen. It's just projected on it. And in a way, I think that is one of the ways which Buddha talks about ending of suffering. That doesn't mean the movies are not going to be projected. The thoughts are not going to be projected on the screen. But the screen itself, you learn to dissociate the movie from the screen. And that way, when somebody projects a movie on that screen, you know what it is. It doesn't get mixed up in your mind. It doesn't keep repeating itself in one way. Yeah.
How do you see the difference between action and effort? In the Eightfold Path, there's right action and right effort.
Right.
I don't seem to see the difference, other than it comes downstream of there's action and there's livelihood and then there's effort. Is the effort kind of like the efficiency of the action?
No. So the first one was a right view.
Yeah.
Right. So if you have a view that, okay, let's come back to the same topic of meditation, for example. If you have a right view that this is going to be beneficial for me, so you take up that view in the right angle. And the right angle would be to make the right resolve. It connects back to the resolve. The right view is connected to the resolve.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you have the right view, you immediately make the resolve to put that right view into action. And you do that with the right speech, with the right dialogue. You bring it into action. You bring it into right action. But the action cannot happen without sustained effort. So when you have the right means, the resources to put in the right amount of effort, then you have the right effort. Till then, it's just an action where your effort is not fully in it because you still have to build the resources.
So the effort would be like sustained action.
Sustained effort, yeah, sustained.
Yes, okay. Sustained action, okay.
So this is, again, this is my own definition of the whole process. But if you read text, you'll see different interpretations. But
Well, of course, there's translations too,
Yes.
right? So it's sometimes something gets lost in the translation sometimes too. Yeah.
I'm just bringing it back into the context as a process of practicing. Because these can be just ideas that you can read. But Buddha's main emphasis was not just, in many times he says, what you read is of no point unless and until it comes back into practice.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, what you read, if you read 1,000 hours and if you practice for half an hour, that's meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
But if you read for 2 hours and practice 1,000 hours, there's a lot of meaning in it because the 2 hours of reading will be translated into practice. As long as what you read is within the right view and right resolve and right speech and right action. If those are not right, then again, if you come back to concentration mindfulness, it's going to be disturbance. So that's how you fine tune it. It's like having a radio station. First is the volume button, right? How loud you want it and how soft you want it. So initially you want it really loud so that you don't get distracted, right? Especially if you're driving in a car on a highway, you want your music turned up a little bit, right? But once you get to a lake and you're sitting by the lake, you don't want loud blaring music, you want something soft. So at later stages of meditation, it's like a sitting by a lake, the volume. But the other button is equally important, finding the right station, right? You don't want to tune into stations which is going to be of disturbance to your concentration and mindfulness. You want to tune into those stations which give you the right view, right resolve, right speech, right action. And then follows the means of getting the livelihood and the effort to go into concentration and mindfulness and concentration. So that's why I like the 8-4 path, because at any point, even if you're just sitting and if you don't want to really, if your mind is so disturbed, you can just focus on those two lines of thought. One is the Four Noble Truths, right? And that can expand your mind right away and settle down your mind. That there is suffering is you can see it. You can just look at your own lifetime. You can see that as you're going to grow older, there's going to be that. And that immediately puts you into the right view. So that's why the Four Noble Truths are very useful, because they immediately put you back into the right view. And once you put you in the right view, you can follow through with those other steps. That's the challenge. The challenge is your mind has the tendency to forget. But how do you reignite those thought processes? And that's why I left the message with the Four Noble Truths and the 8-4 path. Because if you connect them together, they form a nice network to bring your mind back into a meditative inquiry rather than something else.
Yeah, it's very clean. I really like what he teaches. It's the challenge, I guess, is that it's simple, but it's not easy. So
Yes.
yeah, it's like the persistence is definitely needed. Yeah.
Actually, in that particular, if anybody is interested, in that particular person, I can give Steve the details. There are a couple of books which really stand out for a beginner. One is called Head and Heart Together, and in that it's just about 12 or 10 essays, which he talks about different facets of how you approach mindfulness, how you approach meditation, how you approach this whole thing, and what the benefit of it is. And the second one is, which I've already given a link to it, which is called with each and every breath.
If you could send that one again
With
too.
each and every breath. So these two books give you a lot of guidance in terms of how to do it. But sometimes you have to, because they come from a monastic framework, it's a lot more rigorous. But the framework is there, it's essential. And the reason why I'd like to come out and speak to this in these kind of events is because I think sometimes we are not aware of these things when you read those books, because they are a little bit more deeper than what our minds can absorb. Because if you sit with it for a while, only then you start to get the framework. And he actually comes in the summer to Saskatoon and conducts retreats, but it's a 2-day retreat, 2 to 3 day retreat. His name is Thani Saro Bhikkhu.
I'll sound that out.
If you can let us know when
I
he
can write it
comes,
down for you.
because he has a retreat, and I went to a few hours of it. It's very, very nice. It was at the Albert Center on Clarence there, upstairs in the big room. Very interesting presentation he gives.
And does he speak as clearly as this fellow here?
Very-
I like the way he was very entertaining.
Very clearly, yeah. Very
He's
clear.
much more into the actual method. And so, for the 2.5 days of his practice. Most of it can be just on the ground. And he does a lot of guided meditation. He guides you through the meditation, and I don't think I'm qualified to do that. So that's why I didn't do it. But actually, the best way he says, he always says that, without meditation, all the talking is useless. So he actually sits with you and he takes you through a 40 to 50-minute meditation. And what that does is, it gives you guidance. And that's why he says the guidance of the teacher is very essential. Because the teacher gives you guidance during the meditation of where to watch, what to watch, how to watch. And the aspects of what we call as hindrances has a much different phase. It's a much different animal during the process. It's a lot different. It's like watching a National Geographic show about a lion on the screen, right? That's what I did. I showed you a movie, but he'll show you the actual lion in front of you. That's the difference. The difference is a lot more. Because that's why they have retreats. It's for 2.5 days.
I'll just remind everybody that we unfortunately with this restaurant we have to be out at 9. So they'll come around and we probably have about 5 minutes left. So I think we want to first of all say thank you to Prakash for coming out. That was a great round of applause for coming out this evening. And just so you know, when you go out, if you want to pay at the door for whatever you had, and feel free to leave a tip for the waitress who came around too. And just before we go, Ash, I wanted to present, this is from all of us. Rick makes these up. This is our
I got one last time.
CK Speakers Forum. The last one might have been from Coffee Chat. This is our Speakers Forum event. And also, everybody who contributed tonight with a cover charge here, we'd like to give this to you as a gratuity for thanks for coming out. For coming out and helping us out. I find that you have such a great way of communicating.
Right.
A very complex idea, I think, that in the minds of many, including myself, this idea of meditation. But it always amazes me how useful what the Buddha was teaching. It really is. So often I thought that meditation was some kind of a spiritual prayer or whatever, but it seems like it's a very practical thing that can be used in any area of our lives. And what you talked about there about walking, just paying attention to the steps, that becomes almost like the breath exercise.
See, one of the things in the forest tradition, which I didn't talk much, is that there are some people who just do walking meditation. They walk for 10, 12 hours a day. But the way they do it is they create a path, and they walk back and forth, and they watch their steps, and as they watch their breath. So it depends on how you feel about the whole thing, and sometimes,
It's kind of like the mind breath they have out of the civic center. It's that energy that you create through the pattern, the path,
But I think the important thing is that we have such a sophisticated mind, and if you don't train it,
it makes sense because we train everything else. We train our physical body, we train ourselves in our jobs, and so on. So the machinery, if you will, or the mechanisms that we use, why not train it as best we can?
so even if it's a bad day, you just go to the gym. So even if it's a bad day, you come and sit for about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
That's the way to look at it.
So I guess with more and more meditation, you have actually fewer bad days because your perception shifts.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. That's awesome.
But I think the take-home lesson from Buddha or all these teachers is that practice is the most essential part of the whole practice. You have to sit and do it, or you do walking meditation or whatever. But you have to take it as a word that will translate something useful in the future. Right? You won't see immediate benefits. A lot of people who go for retreats and do this, they start it off, and they think they have achieved some kind of euphoric moment, and they just give up. But if you look at his own example, or Buddha's own example, he never gave up. Once he understood that, he started teaching. And as he was teaching, he was meditating. And he was meditating, he was teaching.
Becomes
And
a-
that's what his lifelong goal was. And I think if you really want to honor that, I think the best way to do it is to do it ourselves. No matter what our beliefs of other things are associated with it, we can translate it into our own reality. We don't have to be what we think as a Buddhist, but we can translate it into our own reality of how we work with our minds.
Well, I mean, everything else we do fairly regularly. Most people take a shower every day, most people eat every day.
Right.
Most people go to work every day, etc.
Right.
So to the training of the mind would be
Something that
equally we can do that every day.
I think, but the interesting part is that's what controls the rest.
That's what controls the rest. That should be first daily exercise.
Exactly.
Yeah, in the
That's what
morning.
controls the
Right in the
rest.
morning, right in the morning, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's great. Prakash.
So, you go into different types of breath? You use different types of breath, like Vijaya breath,